Exodus chapter 6, verse 28 says, "On the day when the Lord spoke to Moses in the land of Egypt, the Lord said to Moses, I am the Lord. Tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, all that I say to you. But Moses said to the Lord, Behold, I am of uncircumcised lips. How will Pharaoh listen to me? And the Lord said to Moses, See, I have made you like God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall tell Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go out of his land. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the people of Israel from among them." Moses and Aaron did so. They did just as the Lord commanded them. Now Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So tonight's going to be a little bit different than what we normally do, because that's as far as we're going to get in Exodus right now. And the reason why is there was a central thing that happened in the middle of this passage that was mentioned, that's mentioned 12 other times in the book of Exodus. And so instead of talking about it every time it is brought up, we're going to talk about it one time right now, so that way when we run into it later, we'll all have a category of what's being communicated here. And what was said here is in verse 3. It's one of the most controversial parts of the story of the Exodus. And in verse 3 it says, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart." That phrase we already saw in chapter 4, and it's going to be used at the end of every single plague. That either the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It will be mentioned after every single plague, and then mentioned again right before Pharaoh commands his legions to go after the children of Israel after they have left, to try and corner them at the Red Sea, and then go into the Red Sea and have all of his armies destroyed. The Lord, or Pharaoh, or his heart was hardened at least 12 times throughout this narrative. And this is important to understand for a number of different reasons, but right around a year ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and while I was in Washington, D.C., I was there for an event on reaching the nations and reaching those who are unreached people groups in different countries and things like that. And so the group that I was living with when we were done and left, we were all just fired up on evangelism, you know? It's just like, let's get out there, let's bring the gospel to the nations, the whole thing. And so I sit in the Uber on the way to the airport with one of the new friends that I had just made and another new friend that I had just made. Didn't know either of them super well, but as we're sitting in the Uber, we get to talking with the Uber driver, and she was a Muslim. And so immediately the guy next to me was locked and loaded. He was just going hard, asking questions, all of those things. And she was just like kind of overwhelmed. And I was like, okay, what's going to happen to this? And then when it ended, she was like, hey, I'd love to continue the conversation with you guys. But they all had left, and I was the only one in the car still. So she was now talking to me, even though I was kind of the most quiet one in the back seat. And so I get her Facebook, and then she connects me to her friend, and I set up this call with this guy. And so he calls and talks to me, and as we're talking, I kept trying to bring up grace, about how God's grace is the thing that makes Christianity so different than everything else. And he says, Allah is merciful. Allah is merciful. That's how every single chapter of the book of the Quran starts, is that Allah is merciful. So yeah, you work hard, you do everything right, and then Allah takes care of the rest. He's merciful, and so we trust in his mercy. And I was like, well, God's grace is different than that. It's more and I was trying to explain the difference of what God's grace is in comparison to Allah's definition and Muslim definition of mercy, and it was a struggle to try and penetrate that difference. And what this chapter, or this concept of hardening Pharaoh's heart, ironically gets us to is to grace. Gets us to what it means for God to work on behalf of every individual, work on behalf of Christians, work on behalf of us to save us. And this story of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart gives us insight into that very difference. So, at the end of this, there will probably be questions. And that's okay. We have a bonfire afterwards. We can talk late into the night. I'm happy to talk through it, but I hope to give a general overview so we can, as we read the plagues and we're getting into all this, and we read this phrase that Pharaoh's heart was hardened to the Lord, hardened Pharaoh's heart, we kind of understand what's going on. And the first thing we have to do is zoom out a little bit in order to be able to understand the biblical conception of heart and its state. Heart in Hebrew communicates not just the emotions. Oftentimes in our modern vernacular, if someone's heart is touched, then that means their emotions are affected and their emotions are moved. But biblically, the heart is the seat of the entire person. It doesn't communicate just emotions, but instead their mind. So in the Bible, you'll see people making decisions with their heart because it's the seat of their mind and also the seat of their will, where they then follow through with those actions. So the mind, will, and emotions all culminate within the heart. It's the kind of like core of the human person. And the Bible, in describing what the heart is, the natural state of the human heart, it says in Jeremiah 17, I believe verse 36, that the heart is, does anyone know? Deceitful. The heart is deceitfully wicked above all else. Who can know it? So the essential core, the seat of the person, the mind, will, and the emotions, at its very core is deceitful, wicked. In the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about how the natural man, the person in and of themselves cannot understand spiritual things. Or in Romans chapter 5, it says that man is enemies of God. So the fundamental disposition of the human heart is antagonistic towards God, antagonistic towards spiritual things, enemies of God, hard-hearted in and of themselves. So when we think about what it means for God to harden Pharaoh's heart, we're going to be introduced into a metaphor later on of the potter and the clay. God is the potter, we are the clay. And when God creates pottery, how does pottery become hardened? You put it in the fire and you bake it, and that removes the moisture. So there's no longer any moisture. That's what makes it hard. Biblically, when we understand God's relationship to humanity in the hardening process, it's the removal of the water of God's grace. And we see this specifically in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, it describes the Gentile nations, how they're constantly going after idols. They exchanged the image of God for the image of man. They worshiped the creature rather than the creator, and it just constantly spiraling into disaster. And it says in response to this that God gave them up to their desires. Twice it says that in Romans chapter 1. Which communicates that God is hardening their hearts, giving them over to what they already want. He's not creating evil within them. He's removing his restraining grace that kept them from going headlong into full-on rebellion, giving them up to what they actually want. So the hardening process here in Pharaoh's heart is not God creating evil. It's not God forcing him to do something against his will. Instead, it is allowing the natural hard heart of humanity to go headlong into what it really wants, into what it really desires. And when we think about what it means for us to go headlong into our depraved nature, we often think that our wills are neutral. Meaning that the human will, we have free will, right? And so our free will, we can choose right or wrong. And so we have this capacity in ourselves for choosing. We have this free will. In the Bible, it talks about how you and I, we do have free will. We have a will that makes us culpable for our actions. But Jonathan Edwards, one of the greatest theologians that America has ever produced, in talking about free will, he says what free will is biblically is that humans always do what they most want. So no one is ever forced to do something against their will. And you might be thinking, well, what about if I get robbed at gunpoint? I have to give away my money. I didn't want to give away that money. It's like, no, you actually wanted to preserve your life more than you wanted the money. So you still did what you most want. We always do what we most want, is how he defines free will. And so when we think about the natural heart of man, which is antagonistic to God, what will the natural human heart always do? Rebel. Will always turn away, naturally in and of themselves. And Martin Luther wrote this book called The Bondage of the Will, which said that our will is in bondage to sin and that we constantly rebel against God. That is the natural state of humanity. And you might be thinking, okay, so this is all talking about Pharaoh, that he has this hard heart and all of those things, and he's naturally inclined, but we are no better than Pharaoh. Oftentimes we want to try and locate this in somewhere else, but the reality is the Bible teaches that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That this is all of our hearts, that we have a heart that's desperately wicked above all else. And in my job personally, I get the privilege to be able to see some people do amazing things. I work in the nonprofit space, and they're just going out and doing just incredible good work. But what it also gives me an insight into is they're doing really good work in the darkest places. The place where evil is not as shrouded as it oftentimes is in our everyday lives. Where I was just in Africa, and we were learning about how on some key building projects, before they lay the foundation, because in order to bring blessing upon the household and blessing upon the building as it goes, they do a sacrifice in order to be able to incur blessing upon this building. And the sacrifice is of human children. So literally the foundation of these buildings are built upon sacrificed children. And we think, oh, that's just over in Africa. That's just somewhere else. And the reality is we do not understand the grace of God restraining the evil within our own human hearts. We're no better in and of ourselves than Pharaoh. The evil that we see Pharaoh doing, killing babies, throwing them that's not unique. Moses himself was a murderer. So when we think about the human heart, it is naturally inclined towards evil. And so the real question is not how could God allow the human heart to go that way, or how God's restraining grace, hardening Pharaoh's heart. Instead, how can anyone be saved? If that's the natural state of our hearts, how can any of us be saved, come into right relationship with God? And that is the question that's answered in Romans chapter 9. And so everyone turn to Romans chapter 9. This is where Pharaoh is referenced in the New Testament. And so when I wasn't going to go into this deeply because I didn't really want to. But as you try and see where characters are mentioned in other places of the Bible. This is the place in the New Testament where Pharaoh is mentioned, like the pinnacle spot. And so I was like working through it, and I was like, I can't do this in a short period of time. So we need to just work through Romans 9 together in order to be able to understand it and the process of salvation and what God does for us. And so we're going to start in Romans chapter 9, verse 11. And in Romans chapter 9, verse 11, up to this point, what has happened is Paul is talking, and he has described how Jacob and Esau, who are children of a promise, children of a miracle, how Jacob, the younger, who doesn't deserve it, is blessed, he's saved, and Esau is not. He's not elected. And we'll see what he says. He says in verse 11, though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. So let's work through this together. We'll try and be as biblical as possible to see what is going on here. Though they were not yet born and had done nothing either good or bad. So is election God's blessing of deciding and choosing before the foundation of the world those who would be saved? That's what election means. Election means that before the foundation of the world, God decided, these are my people. They are elected. Was that based upon something that they were or they did? Was that something that they made some decision, or they had something in and of themselves that then caused God to say, yeah, you're a part of my team now? No, it says, though they were not yet born and had not done anything, good or bad, in order that God's purpose of election might continue, not because of works, but because of him who calls. So in other words, it was just God's divine initiative, where God, before the foundation of the world, chose his people, not because of what we've done, but simply for his own purpose. As it was told, the older shall serve the younger. Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And when we hear that phrase, Jacob I loved, Esau I've hated, most often people look at the Esau I've hated and said, what? But remember what we just established. The natural heart of humanity is antagonistic towards God. So therefore, the thing that's surprising about this is not Esau I have hated, but Jacob I have loved. Think about who Jacob is. The heel snatcher, the deceiver, the polygamist. Like literally, he does not deserve God's grace. That's what makes it grace. God looked at him and said, you are a part of my team, not because of what you've done. In fact, you deserve nothing but damnation, but I'm going to give you grace instead. It's not Esau I have hated that's the problem. It's Jacob I have loved. And I remember when I was growing up, how I heard this taught was that, I remember I was sitting in church, I was in Southern Oregon, and my pastor, he's got this like big booming voice, and he's got a really fun laugh, and he's just like this great dude. And he said that God looked down the tunnel of time, and he saw who would believe, and chose people based upon foreknowledge of their future faith. He saw who would believe, and then he elected those who would believe. So ultimately, it was their choice. And he even went so far as to say, God picks winners. At this point, I disagree. Because nowhere in this passage was it said that God looked down the tunnel of time and saw people's faith and chose based upon foreknowledge of future faith. Instead, it says that God's purpose of election might stand, not by works, not by anything they've done, either good and bad. In other words, it's solely God's choice of who is elect. And now the question is that fair? Because we're all sitting in our seats right now probably thinking that doesn't seem fair. If God's going to love Jacob, doesn't he have to also love Esau? How could he do that? If he's going to love Moses, the murderer, why doesn't he also love Pharaoh, the murderer? Well, we can know that we're understanding the book of Romans correctly if the objection that we have, Paul addresses. So Paul addresses this objection in the very next verse, where he says, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? Is God being unjust here? By no means, for he says to Moses, now we're getting to our passages in Exodus that mention the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. So how does Paul respond to this objection that there's injustice with God? He goes back to the Moses and the Exodus story, and he says, God said to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. In other words, Moses gets compassion. Moses gets mercy. Pharaoh gets justice. Neither of them get injustice. Injustice is not in the equation. Moses gets mercy. Pharaoh gets justice. Neither get injustice. If you think, or if I think, that it is owed to Pharaoh, if it is owed to Esau to receive mercy, to receive grace, then it is no longer grace. That's what makes grace definitionally grace, is that it's not owed. If we say Pharaoh ought to receive grace, or he deserves that grace, or Esau deserves that grace, then we're saying that it's no longer grace. That's why he's saying, so then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. So God, in his divine foreknowledge, elected some, giving them grace, and then gave others justice. And how he gives them justice through the hardening of their hearts is by the removal of his restraining grace. But then it goes on and it says in verse Did I already read verse 17? I don't think I did. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. So now, then the question is, all right, so God is showing mercy and grace to some, justice to others. What purpose does God have in hardening Pharaoh's heart? Is that arbitrary? Is it meaningless? Is it an accident? Or is there actually a plan behind God's salvific purposes in electing some and giving justice to others? He says right here that for this reason, for this very purpose, I raise you up, that I might show my power in you. Think about this. Moses goes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh rejects the offer. His heart is wicked and evil. And God decides, instead of striking him down right there at that moment, which he was right to do so, instead he says, I am going to withhold my common grace, allow him to go further into what he really wants, and I'm going to use this interaction for my honor and glory, to display my power. So this isn't an arbitrary thing. Instead, it's actually going to contribute to my glory being proclaimed throughout all the ages, because I'm going to do miracles. I'm going to do plagues. I'm going to save my people. I'm going to bring them across the Red Sea. I'm going to do all of these things using the rebellion of Pharaoh. Instead of just smiting him like I could, instead I'm going to use this to bring about, to show and display the power of my might. And how high does that rank on my chart when I think about God's dealing with the world, the demonstration of God's power? So often that does not rank in my evaluation of God's actions. Instead, I think, God, you gotta respect me and or whatever, you gotta value, or what. It's no, what matters is God's glory. And he decided to manifest his power through the hard-heartedness and judgment upon Pharaoh. Again, that is not unjust. It is just that he does what he does, and it ultimately results in his power and glory. And then in verse 19 it says, but you might be saying, but if it's God doing all of this, who can resist his will? That's exactly what he says in verse 19. You shall say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? And so Paul then brings up the other objection. Well, who can resist his will? How could we be morally culpable for any of those things? And he responds by saying, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? And that sounds just kind of like no more questions. Shut the door on this. But I think it actually is a genuine response. Because he then goes into the metaphor of the potter and the clay. And in the potter and the clay, we obviously a difference between the clay and the potter. That the clay is not of the same caliber as the potter. And in our relationship with God, God is infinitely above and superior in worth and value and eternal everything than we are as humans. We cannot possibly comprehend everything that he's doing all the time simultaneously. And when we think, as I often can be tempted to think, that God is arbitrary or capricious, or is this somehow injustice with God or something like that, what I need to remember is that I can't see everything that's going on. I am just a man. And I know that God is sovereign and powerful and all-knowing, but he's also loving. The God of the universe that's electing, that's bringing about justice, is the God of love, is also the God of compassion, also the God of grace. And so if we just see him as infinite, superior, it's no, this is also the God of loving wisdom, orchestrating all things for his glory. And if we don't start with that fundamental assertion, it will sound like God's being capricious or being vindictive, but instead we know that God is loving and kind, so all of his decisions are in accordance with his loving and kind character. And we might not be able to understand that totally, because who are you, oh man? to answer back to God. But so often in these conversations that I've had with people is they try and liken our relationship to God as if we are two chess players sitting across the board from each other. And I make a move and then God makes a move. And then I make a move and then God makes a move. But every move that I make doesn't do anything to thwart God's plans, but he just is able to work it all out according to his plan, and he still accomplishes his purposes, and he's just such a good chess player that there's nothing I can do to try and overcome him. And that is a very attractive analogy. I used that analogy before I really dug into Romans 9. The problem with that is that assumes equals. Just one that's slightly better, even way better than the other. And the image that is used here is potter and clay. And God, in his creative act over all things, he knows exactly what he's doing, and he molds all things according to the counsel of his will, which is good, gracious, loving, and just. And you might be sitting here thinking, this is so uncomfortable. I was not ready for this tonight. And there's been so many people who are really uncomfortable with this. But one of my favorite people who wrestled with this was a guy named David Brainerd, who I've mentioned before. I read all of his journal entries. And before he had this conversion experience, he struggled with the sovereignty of God in salvation. He struggled with this, and he wrote in his journal, he wrote these things. He wrote out 4 different things that he was like mad about God. Like, these are the things that I really don't get and I really don't understand. And number 4 was this. He says, another thing to which I found a great inward opposition was the sovereignty of God. I could not bear that it would be wholly at God's pleasure to save or damn me, just as he would. That passage, Romans 9, 11 through 23, what we just read, was a constant vexation to me. I dared not venture myself into the hands of God as wholly helpless at the disposal of his sovereign pleasure. I dared not see that important truth concerning myself, that I was dead in trespasses and sins. Have you sat before God and realized your helplessness? That it is within God's purview to save or to damn. That salvation is not ultimately of ourselves. That salvation is of the Lord. Have you reckoned with that? This was a constant vexation to David Brainerd. And I remember in my life when it hit me that God could save me or not according to his plan, and that I had nothing to do with it, that salvation was truly of the Lord, that I was dead in my trespasses and sins, that I was an enemy of God, and that God could have easily hardened my heart and been just to do so, to send me to hell for his glory, and that instead he decided to save me. It made me feel totally and completely out of control. And that's exactly where we ought to be, because salvation is not in our control. If it was in our control, then I would lose it. If I could lose my salvation, I would. If it was in my hands, it would slip. And then when David Brainerd wrestled with this and he came to a saving faith, he had this beautiful vision of God while he was walking through a glade, and it was just this beautiful thing. But he said, at this time, the way of salvation opened to me with such infinite wisdom, suitableness, and excellency that I wondered I should ever think of any other way of salvation. I wondered that all the world did not see and comply with this way of salvation entirely by the righteousness of Christ. He saw it and then rejoiced in it and was like, oh, I wanted it to be up to me, but it's up to him. That's such a better place to have it. Not in my hands, but in his hands. And so often I've heard the analogy of salvation put this way. That salvation is like you're out in a lake and you're treading water and you're about ready to drown. And God in his grace throws you a life ring, the life ring of salvation. And you have to grab onto that life ring and he'll pull you into shore. You got to grab on and hold on and you'll get drug in and you'll be saved. It's a sure life ring. It's a perfect life ring. It's a buoyant life ring. And he will for sure bring you all the way in. And you just got to hold on. You got to choose to grab onto it and you'll make it. And that's what salvation is. And here's how I think of salvation now. Salvation, remember what we started with, is that our hearts are desperately wicked. Who can know it? That we're dead in our trespasses and sins. So I'm not treading water on the lake. I'm dead at the bottom of the lake. And not only am I dead at the bottom of the lake, I've turned into a zombie fish. And this zombie fish is trying to dig deeper down as far as he can into the lake. Because the natural man is an enemy of God. And the owner of the lake decides to send his son down to go and swim to the bottom of the lake, to grab this zombie fish thing and rescue it. And as the son goes down, dives into the lake, swims down to the very bottom, grabs the zombie fish thrashes, bites, claws, does everything it can to try and get away from the Savior. And the Savior grabs it, swims back up, but is so exhausted, gets to the very end, gives resuscitation, and dies in the process, but rescues the zombie fish, who turns back into a normal human and is resurrected. But it cost the life of the son in order to do so. And now me, this zombie fish, been resurrected, can look at the death that was paid, the sacrifice that was done, the grace that was shown, and I rejoice out of pure gratitude and thankfulness, because it was nothing that I've done. God did not have to save anyone. By his grace, he does save those whom he has chosen before the foundation of the world. And then by his grace, then, he decides to go and save those for whom he has called. And now you might be thinking, okay, how does this go back to Pharaoh? Let's go back to Pharaoh, and then we'll close here in just a second. So God's working in the world looks like this. With the Pharaohs and the Esau's, he hardens their heart by removing his restraining common grace, the water of his grace. But in salvation, what he does, it says in verse 3, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you." He performs signs and wonders to bring about salvation. Oftentimes, what can be confusing is that people think that God is active in salvation and he's also active in sending people to hell. No, people want to go to hell. C.S. Lewis says that the doors are locked from the inside. That's where people are going. He doesn't have to actively do anything for people to go straight into hell. Instead, God actively does signs and wonders to bring about salvation. It is an active thing on God's initiative that he comes and dies for his people. And it is an act of a miracle. And here's what this means for you and me. Because salvation is a miracle, it's a sign and a wonder that you and I are saved, that means there's nobody that's too far gone. Think about the person in your life that is most antagonistic to Christianity. The person in your life who hates God, who was hurt by the church, who's been living in sin forever, who had a terrible upbringing, who's living on the streets, who's living in abject sin or whatever else. That person is not too far gone for God, because salvation is a miracle. And my salvation and your salvation was just as much of a miracle as it would be for that person to be saved, because it wasn't about us. It wasn't about what we have done. So now we have hope for every single person in our lives, because it's not like they have to clean themselves up. God goes down to the bottom of the lake and rescues them. And so what does it mean? That there's no person that's beyond hope. But not only that, we can go and pray for people to be saved, asking God to rescue them. And our prayers might be the means through which people get saved. If salvation was only up to the individual, then there's no reason to pray for them. Because God would specifically say, no, I don't save, I provide a way of salvation. They have to hold on to the life ring. So go talk to them. Instead, we can talk to the creator of the universe, the one who fashions all things, and say, God, save this person. And by his grace, he might use us as the means through which they become saved. Not only that, it means that in your life and in my life, if you go and decide to share your faith, you can do so in confidence. I would be so scared to stand up and teach if it was up to me to convince you and every person that I talk to. If it was up to me to convince them and it was up to them to decide initially that they had to make the first decision to follow after God, then I would be so scared because I would be nervous to mess it up. I was very scared my first few years of teaching because I thought if I misspeak and give the wrong impression, I might be sending someone to hell. But God in His grace is sovereign over all things, and He can use even an idiot like me to speak His word, and He will bring about His salvation, because before the foundation of the world, He predestined those whom He called, and whom He called, He justified, He glorified. It's all up to Him. And so if you're going and sharing your faith, don't be afraid that they might have a question that you don't know the answer to. That's okay. Share God's love to them and go in confidence, knowing that God saves His people. Salvation is of the Lord. And how God saved us is through His death, through His crucifixion. A tremendous act of love. When we think about all of these things, it's easy to get caught in God's sovereignty and all this theological esoteric stuff. But remember that the God who ordains all things is the God who died, the God who suffered, the God who was tempted in every point like as we are, yet without sin. And one of my favorite novels is Crime and Punishment by a guy named Dostoevsky. And at the end of the book, the main character is in prison. And I'm not spoiling it because it's literally in the title, Crime and Punishment. So, and if you're going to read it, it's been out for 200 years. So that's on you. But at the end, he's in prison. And as he's in prison, he had committed a murder. And so he's in prison. Also, that happens in the first couple chapters. So, and during the course of the story, he becomes really close with a girl who's a prostitute. And as he's sentenced after his murder to go to prison for 7 years, this woman, who was a prostitute, decides to follow him to Siberia to go to prison. And the author Dostoevsky spent years of his life in Siberia, in prison, for doing something underneath the Tsar regime. And so he's writing from an experience at this labor camp in prison, and the selfless act of the woman, Sonia is her name, going and being with Raskolnikov, very weird name, in prison, slowly changes Raskolnikov's heart. And she was there, this act of selfless love, going to support this murderer in prison. Eventually, he is broken by this sacrificial love of this woman for him, that it describes this at the very end of the book. It says, tears stood in their eyes. They were both pale and thin, but in those pale, sick faces, there already shone the dawn of a renewed future, of complete resurrection into a new life. They were resurrected by love. How we are resurrected is through the love of God. And God in His grace did something so much greater than Sonia. Not just going to those of us who were in prison as we were slaves to sin, but those who are dead in our trespasses and sins. He died for us that we might live. And so if this brought up a ton of questions for you, totally understand. I'd be happy to talk about it. We'll have a bonfire afterwards. And I hope, though, you can rest in the knowledge that salvation is of the Lord, and that God in His grace has worked on our behalf to save us through His death. So that way now we can live and be resurrected and renewed because of His love. So Lord, thank You for Your grace. Thank You for what You've done for us. And we remember, Lord, that You are sovereign, You are King, and so we submit ourselves to everything that You are. Thankful that You in Your grace decided to save even though You didn't have to, but instead it's truly by grace. So we commit ourselves to You, pray that You'd bless tonight, and we pray this in Your name. Amen.